Welcome to the Mosaic World Podcast. Today I'm pleased to have with me Dr. Bruce Lloyd, an Emeritus Professor of Strategic Management at the London South Bank University. I especially wanted to have Bruce with me today as I have had a few thought-provoking conversations with him in which he has done an excellent job of framing concepts and ideas I've expressed to him. In addition to his many other accolades, he is also a reviewer of Professional Manager. And he loves to explore the themes of wisdom, leadership, the future, and a wise society, together with the various connections among those concepts. This, to me, makes Bruce the perfect person to explore leadership in a mosaic world with me. So thank you very much for being with me here today, Bruce.
Pleasure.
Can I start off by asking you, around when and where were you born?
When was I born?
Around when? I'm not asking for your specific age, but it's just nice to have an idea to frame your experience. So around when and where were you born?
Well, actually, I was born in 1941, and I was born in a little island called Guernsey, the south of England, during the German occupation in the last war.
Okay.
So that may tell some people a lot.
Gosh, I think it almost says so much already with that. And that makes me wonder, what was it like for you growing up in that area? I'm assuming you grew up there.
Yes, I did grow up there, and I went to school there, and I left the island to go to university. And although I've been back and I have family over there, I've been living in London really since I came over to university, which originally was to do a degree in chemical engineering, which I did eventually.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. But I'm just curious, can you say just a little bit more about what it was like growing up in Guernsey, I guess for almost the first 20 years of your life?
Well, the first thing is, of course, I was quite young and I don't remember much about the actual occupation. I've read a lot about it. I've been told a lot about it, but those are second-hand sources of information rather than my direct recalling of experiences. If I want to go back to early influences, I was at school on the island. It was supposedly the best school on the island. But I was, I think, quite a difficult pupil. I was an outsider, and I kept on asking the question, what's the point of all this? And the teachers at the time were not professionally trained as they are now. And I was not very motivated in most areas, although I seemed to do quite well in maths and eventually got enough A levels to get to university.
Okay, no, that's interesting to hear. And I guess that actually speaks to your natural curiosity as well and questioning of things.
Yes, and the other thing that I think happened on reflection was that from very early on, I was a bit of a rebel, bit of a maverick in a way. I didn't join in a lot of things, although I did play a bit of cricket, not very well. But I used to do a lot of reading and working on my own, and got into a rather habit, and I think my mother taught me this by accident, challenging authority. It wasn't what I was supposed to learn, but I think I spent quite a bit of my early life being a bit of a rebel, which has stayed with me most of my life in a way.
Yeah. And when you talk about rebelling against authority, doing things differently, it makes me wonder, did you see something wrong with the norm?
Well, it was a combination of two things when I look back. Of course, everybody was against the German authority. And that made the environment in which you were living early on sort of there was a lot of emphasis on survival for people, and there wasn't a lot of time for what I would call affection. So that was those sort of influences, I think, have stayed with me a little bit.
Yeah. Because then I'm curious, because you, as you said, you went on to do a degree, chemical engineering, done an MBA at
Yes.
London Business School. You've worked across industry for numerous years before you went into academia. What informed your journey?
Originally, I was quite interested in doing a degree in economics, but not very many places did that. I don't think I was ever committed to being an engineer, but I managed to find at the time a scholarship that paid for my university. And as soon as I finished my degree, I worked a little bit in the oil industry for a couple of years. And then I knew that I wasn't wanting to do that. I was wanting to do something much broader. And that got me into the MBA, which the London Business School, I was fortunate to get on the first program that they ever had. And of course, we were lucky then because we got ESCR grants to go. So right from leaving the island, I was able to be independent, which is something that I think I was very keen to do. Ultimately, if I was asked now what my original ambition was, I think it would have been to go and work in some way for the United Nations. Coming from a very parochial part of the world, I think I was aware of a much broader global context for everything. And so the MBA was, in a way, a vehicle for moving out of engineering into something else. Now, one of the jobs that I got offered at the time was in the city to do investment analysis. And that seemed to be about as far away from engineering as I could possibly get. So I started off in that area and applied relatively early on to go and work for an international development organization called the Commonwealth Development Finance Company, which was a global organization looking at investments. I didn't hear from them for a long time, and they suddenly rang me up and said, "When can you start?" Because I think they were just had a vacancy to fill. And so I worked for several years for them. During that period, I did actually get offered a job with the International Finance Corporation. and they flew me to Washington for interviews. But I thought it was a far too big bureaucratic organization, and that I wouldn't be able to survive in it. I think part of my career, such as it is, has been a desperate attempt to combine focus with flexibility. And generally speaking, the focus has lost out. But you can't do everything. That's one of the horrendous messages that people have to learn. And in today's world, people get so many more choices compared with 50 years ago that it must be incredibly difficult to begin to get that balance right. And there are all sorts of new problems that people have to face, such as dyslexia and attention deficit disorder, both of which I suspect I would have been defined as having had they been invented. Well, had the investigation of them been invented, I'm pretty sure that they were still there, but they hadn't been labeled at the time. Anyway, that's taken me through quite a few years.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I'm just wondering, with the work that you did on the international front, did it give you the opportunity to travel and explore different places as well?
Yes. Yes, interestingly enough, one of the early places I traveled to was to Brazil, which is in the news today.
Yes.
And was looking at investments in Brazil, amazing place even at the time. And I also had a very bizarre experience in a way, because I had to fly to Fiji for a board meeting of a company that the organization had an investment in. And I think I slept through the whole board meeting, to my great embarrassment. But it was, the company was trying to do minority investments in projects with British or Commonwealth connections around the world. And it was a very intense learning experience as to how difficult it is to make those sort of investments successful.
Yeah. No, I can only begin to imagine, but I also think you probably might have a different view on the world, of the global world, than you would have had if you hadn't had the opportunity to go to different places.
Oh, sure. And I remember spending several visits in the 60s. No, it must have been the early 70s, to Nigeria.
My country of origin.
Lagos, Kaduna, Kano, and we got the Nigerian Industrial Development Bank going. We were involved with Nigerian sugar, Nisuko, and Metal Box in Nigeria, and I think Dunlop in Nigeria. It was a busy time, but it was very interesting time, because although I was in many situations the only person from outside Nigeria at all sorts of occasions, it never crossed my mind or noticed anything strange about it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I have to ask the question, what did you think of Nigeria? What's your impression of Nigeria?
Then it was a very busy place with lots of development problems. And unfortunately, many of these have got worse. But it wasn't I think it was after the Biafra War, if I remember rightly. And but they never had any of the problems that they now have in the north and in it's such a shame. It's so horrendous around the world these days.
The security problems we're talking
People
about.
just can't get on with each other.
Yeah.
And that's something that I revisited later on when I started writing about the relationship between power and responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, there's several things that cross my mind as you've been talking. Because for one, formally, you've now retired.
Yes.
But you don't stop, because I know you're still actively researching and having all these conversations and doing different things. What is it that motivates you to continue and to do what you do?
Just to go back a step further, when I started working, I travelled a bit when I was at university. And I wrote a bit of my travels. I went to Poland and on an exchange program. I went to the Soviet Union and I went to the United States on an exchange program. And I wrote a bit about that. And when I came out while I was at the business school, I wrote a pamphlet for the Fabian Society on the future of energy policy. I didn't have to do it. I just felt I wanted to check. In a way, it was always trying to challenge the status quo of the general view. And when I got into other jobs later, I always was writing articles about something or other. I wrote articles on the role of capital markets in developing countries, which were published in quite a few different countries, and they were very interested. I wrote about corruption and where and how you draw the line. I never had to do any of this. I just wanted to do it as a way of trying to challenge some of the accepted ideas. But that activity ended up by standing me in very good stead when I ended up in the academic world, because I had quite a long list of, they weren't very thoroughly academic publications, but they were articles that had been published in respectable journals. And so that, I think, helped me survive in a way in the academic world, although I was never really an academic.
Yeah. I'd like to see myself moving along those lines in terms of writing, researching, being curious about the world, and that ultimately enabling me to interact with the academic world based on the knowledge and, dare I say, wisdom.
Yes.
Present.
Well, I think that it's never too soon to put these ideas on paper, and you're doing you do that, or you've done that already, and you've got useful and important things to say, and I think that that's what keeps me active in a way.
Yeah.
Because you can't. The more active you've been, the harder it is to adjust to doing nothing. Although I do have a lot of books to read, which are being recycled to other uses. In fact, a large number. Because I was a book review editor for 25 years, I did have a very large collection of business books, and most of these have gone. And they went to the London Business School in their new building, where they've got an open access library, which is an interesting concept, because people can come and take books away if they want, and bring them back if they want, but bring other books back if they want.
Okay,
that's quite a lot of shelves in this workspace, almost a coffee bar workspace, that sort of activity works very well.
Yeah. I mean, and that's interesting to know. I might visit them one day. At the same time, I wonder, with all your writing, you've got quite a body of work that you've done. Is there anywhere that people can go to find your writing, because especially when you talk about things like what you did for the Fabian Society on energy, I would think that becomes more relevant today than ever before. Plus all the other things you've written. Do you have your own Wikipedia or somewhere, your own library, or where people can access your work?
No, it's a simple answer to that. But there's a lot of stuff that I've written is on the internet. And I've never searched. I would search the Fabian Society's book list, but they should have a website, and that should be on there. I'm not sure that it was or is now particularly relevant. It was written in the 60s, and the main theme of it, which was challenging the way that the left, if you like, was so enthusiastic in their support of coal. I said that by the end of the century, coal is going to be a very small part of our agenda, and most of our coal mines were being run as social service programs rather than businesses at that time. And I also argued that a lot of effort needed to be put into generating new jobs for the coal miners who weren't going to be working down the mines. But my assumption was that nuclear power was going to be playing a dominant role in power production, which actually it has in France, but it never really did in Britain for reasons that I don't entirely understand. But of course, the disasters in Chernobyl and Fukushima have set back the development of nuclear power quite a bit, although I still think it's an important source of energy for the future.
Yeah. These days, people talk quite a bit about thought leadership.
Yes.
But I would say, without question, you're thought leader. You're one of those people that are really able to look at a current situation and do the analysis and say, like what you've mentioned in relation to the coal industry, this isn't going to be here in the future. We need to look after or review what we do in relation to the people working in that industry.
Right.
And if people had listened to you, dare I say, if people had listened to you at the time, certain things might have been different, might have been better in relation to people that worked in the industry, some that are still unemployed or suffering the effect that it's had on whole communities. So you're a real thought leader in the true sense of the word.
Well, let me just say a couple of things about that. It's very kind of you to say that, but one of the fortunate things for me was that my formative years were in the 60s. And an awful lot of futures thinking took place in the 60s. We had people landing on the moon, we had Concorde, we had nuclear power. Technology was a major driver of optimism for the future. And a lot of organizations started right in the 60s. like the World Future Society, the World Future Studies Federation, the Long Range Planning Journal, which I got involved in. And I was at the edge of all those for most of the period in the 70s and 80s. But I never really, and that's this flexibility and focus issue. I never really stayed with energy policy. I moved on to something else. I moved on to other articles. I don't really think I've written any articles on energy policy since I wrote that in the 60s. But the other thing that happened because I got into lecturing and researching strategy in the 90s, one of the things that I criticized strategy textbooks for, and a lot of strategy writers for, so I feel a bit guilty that I haven't rewritten a lot of stuff.
There's still time.
That I'm about to go into, and that is that future studies is in a box, which is, and strategy is in another box. And the books on strategy don't deal with future studies. And yet future studies, in my view, is an integral part of strategy. Strategy is far too much about the technicalities of how you get somewhere without exploring where you ought to be going or where things are going to go, even if you don't want them to go that way. So that's what being involved with future studies, and you can get anybody that hasn't done it. I think it's very interesting to just put future studies into Wikipedia, because there's a lot of useful, interesting information that a lot of people have never come across before, and people, particularly people who are concerned with strategy, ought to know about.
Yeah, thank you. And in some ways, that takes me to where we are now. And as you know, I talk about a mosaic world, a world which is rich in its diversity in every sense of the word, with everyone valued for who they are and what they have to offer. With that, we have people in leadership who ideally should be working with people we have that at the political level, we have it at a community level, but specifically at an organizational level, we have people that have to work with people in an ever-growing, complex world. And I think it's fair to say a world which is quite challenged at this point in time. And I can't help but thinking as you're talking that there's a need for people to deal with the present. There's a need for people to think strategically. But then the future studies that you mentioned also comes to play, if my thinking is right, in your opinion.
Yes. And it links in with and I haven't got time to go into detail now. It's very easy for academics, especially being involved in so many different things, to go off on all sorts of tangents. But I got involved in looking at wisdom in the early 90s. And I was lucky enough in the 80s to travel to Nepal and Tibet and various other places that really made me think about all sorts of things around people and the state of the world. And the other thing that happened in the 70s and 80s was that I went to Greece, and I'd never had much time for the Greek heroes. At school, I kept on saying, well, what's the point of all this? But actually, trying to bring together the wisdom of the world, which I did in the run-up to the millennium, because when I was involved with a lot of thinking about what was going to happen in the future, nobody was focusing on what have we really learned from the past that was important to pass on to the future. And there is on the internet, I think, an article on messages for the new millennium, which tried to focus on what was the wisdom that could be distilled from mankind's experience that we really wanted to pass on, that was really important for a better world in the future. And in the end, I've got a lot of volumes, I think they are on the internet, of up to 5,000 messages around the world. If you look at wisdom around the world, almost all of it is interchangeable. You wouldn't recognize, I often played this game with the students in the old days, they never recognized where the sayings of wisdom came from. Now, the reason for that is that wisdom, in my view, is essentially about values, and values are about how we relate to other people. And that is a global fundamental issue. And wisdom and values are essentially about what makes relationships work, what makes organizations work, and what makes society work. And that is something that I spend a bit of time writing about, particularly in the context of power and responsibility. Now, I also wrote a bit about leadership and how we needed to rethink leadership, because I was arguing in the 90s, and I used to put criticism of a lot of books on leadership at the time, because they seemed to think it was all about getting power and making sure that people couldn't take it away from you. And it wasn't about using power responsibly. It wasn't about values. And so I've been arguing for a long time that the core issue in leadership at all levels, and leadership is as much likely to happen at the bottom of an organization as at the top, because at the top of too many organizations, the self-interest factor dominates the behavior, whereas at the bottom, people are much more concerned with relationships and making teams work and groups work. And so the issue about leadership, which I have to say, I suppose it's difficult to be optimistic about, looking at it in the global context. It's getting through in textbooks, it's getting through in other channels, the importance of values. And I think it might well be getting through in the next generation, which they're challenging the institutionalized agendas and the power-driven cultures of a lot of organizations and individuals. But we still have far too many, and it still makes the world an incredibly painful and dangerous place.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much in what you've said. First, I must look up your articles, the message for the new millennial about wisdom across the world, and if I can't find them, I will come back to you, because I think that will be an amazing reference for people. Then I'm just thinking about leadership and what you've said. So for me, there's something to say that leadership needs to be more about responsibility, valuing people, looking out for each other, working together, often about power and holding on to power. Would that be a fair assessment?
Absolutely. But I still haven't resolved the fundamental dilemma. And that is how, if you have two groups of people, and to some extent it's traditionally been a male issue, but I'm not so sure that it isn't a wider issue now than that. But if you have some people who are really interested in their self-interest and power, and the other group are more responsibility-driven and concerned with the interests of other people, they tend to let the people who are self-interested and driven by power get away with too much. And so I don't know how, I've still not found the answer to how do we make it less common to find that we have these narcissistic, power-driven egotists running our organizations and our countries.
I'll ask a question on that comes to mind. Is there any benefit to organizations and wider society by having people that are self-interested, that are focused on their self-interest and power?
I suppose sometimes there's a short-term benefit, but the historic analysis of history, both organizations and countries, is that those individuals who are just concerned with their self-interest and power end up by destroying their organizations and their countries. Because, and what we're seeing now is, and this is a paradox in a way, because a lot of the self-interested people are very energetic and very passionate. But what you've got to do is look at what's the purpose? Where's the purpose? What's the agenda? What are they using power for? And if you come back to the agenda of the importance of values and the relationships, and you can see this all over the world, where societies work very well because the people in them work very well for one reason or another. We've made a terrible mistake of arrogance in Western society, in exporting technology around the world and not realizing that we should be importing humanity, because there's a lot more humanity in the communities, disadvantaged communities in Brazil or in Nepal or in Nigeria or wherever, than you find in a lot of corporate organizations. And we haven't put people at the core of the issues enough. Another criticism I've had of strategy textbooks, HR textbooks, governance textbooks, lots of them, is that they all need to have a chapter at the beginning that focuses on telling people that it's really a people issue.
Yeah.
If you don't get that right, all the technical stuff about strategy won't get you anywhere.
And yet there are some people that carry the view that the purpose of organizations is to make profit.
Yes, I'm not against profit, and I don't know where it came from, but I remember at a very early age coming to the conclusion that profit was a technical factor And the most important thing around organization is how do you make the profit and what do you do with it? Those are values-driven things. And you've got to work that out in order to make sense of the balance sheet that you will then end up producing that has a profit. An awful lot of organizations, most organizations, even social enterprise organizations, they can't operate unless their income exceeds their expenditure. But how they make that income and what they do with their profit is the fundamental issue that makes society work sustainably. And I think nowadays, a lot of the things that I've been concerned with have been repackaged around the issue of sustainability. Well, there's nothing absolute in the concept of sustainability, but it's just something that it's going to be much more effective for societies and organizations if they think about these issues and take them more seriously. Now, if I can just very quickly mention what I've come to the conclusion are two fundamental issues. One's a macro issue and there's a micro issue, but they're very interrelated for society. The first one is, having looked at strategy for quite some time, I think the key to improving the quality of our decision making, whether it's personal or organization, depends more on the quality of the conversations that we have with people than on anything else. And so if you don't operate a learning environment with the relationships that you have with people, although I think probably with books as well, but essentially with people, it's not going to work. And I think a lot of the despotic behavior of ego-driven people gets out of hand because they've cut themselves off from communication and learning, and they get carried away with their own self-importance and arrogance. Now, the second issue is the incredible problem that we have around the world between the haves and the have-nots. And in material terms, that's increasing. And it's increasing in a way that is not sustainable. On the other hand, we in this country and other places of the world that are obsessed with GDP as a measure of societal success, it's very, very dubious. This mantra we had a few weeks ago, growth, 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 is quite problematic because it's a quantity measure, not a quality measure. And we should be spending much more time focusing on social progress indicators rather than just the economist's way of measuring growth in society, which is not sustainable. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, as I said at the beginning, you do an amazing job of taking things that people like myself and dare I say others think about and putting them into very clear, concise concepts, which make it easy for people to understand. And I must say, there's so much food for thought. And what you also do is you answer my questions before I'm even able to ask them. And I guess I'm just thinking of leaders navigating, because I was almost going to conclude with the question as to what you would recommend to them to do in order to be able to navigate through the challenges that we're faced today. Cost of living, it's here in the UK, but I think it's a global issue, because you've got so many people leading in organizations that do want to do their best by their employees who might be struggling. And if they're not struggling directly, they'll have relatives and people that they know that are struggling with their wider community that they're looking to support. But then a lot of organizations have limited resources and limited capabilities themselves. So how do people lead through all of this?
The simple answer is with their values. And hopefully their values are ones that are in the broader context of responsibility for everyone. But in that context, I suspect that society needs to move down the road of more social enterprise activities, more charity plus, not just charity, but the concerns of charity, and also cooperatives. In a way, I've had some time when I've been leading or been responsible for groups of people when I helped set up the management centre at South Bank. And it was a very demanding time because I didn't, I recognized that other people were going to be what made the organization successful or not. All I could do would be to try to help them do their job. I tried to introduce 360-degree appraisals in the early 90s, and it worked reasonably well, but the rest of the university didn't take much notice of that. And one of the important things of leadership, I think, is to recognize that other people are much better at doing jobs than you are. And if you're pretending that you're going to get all the rewards when other people are doing jobs that you couldn't do as well, you're in for trouble. So we made it's a marketing gimmick, really. We made a mistake by spending so much time focusing on leadership, where everybody's a leader, because every time you have some relationship with other people, it involves your values and their values. And it's a leadership transaction. And funnily enough, that often gets less the more further up the organization you go. I do have major issues about how a lot of these large organizations, one of the areas I did some work on a long time ago was around invention, innovation, and size, and around the concept of economies of scale. And even people like Zuckerberg and Facebook are having enormous difficulties because they've grown to an enormous size, but it's difficult for them to innovate successfully around that. And so it's a lot of organizations, big organizations, are going to have an enormous challenge on their hands in adapting to change in the next few years, or they do it at the moment. But the thing about change is that it needs flexibility. You need flexibility, and you need to be concerned with the interests of everybody, not just your interest. And a lot of organizations where the top half of management has a lot of change going on is that they think they're threatened. So their focus becomes much more narrow-minded rather than being genuinely concerned with the long-term interests of the organization. There's a very interesting company you might have come across. That's Patagonia.
Yes.
And it's the person who ran it was a very keen environmentalist, and he did it very successfully. And he's given the company to the employees. And I think that you've got to, that's leadership is about sharing. It's not about egos.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And so for me, one of the key things, amidst all the many things that you said within that, is leadership at whatever level. A fundamental part of that is engaging with others in a way that you're listening to them, truly listening to them, and taking on board what they have to say, as opposed to this is who I am and this is what I'm doing because this is what I believe. But it's an engagement process whereby you could almost say it involves an evolution based on that engagement and how you interact, and that's when you create. And when you create something that works for everyone, which is ultimately the most effective and the best for the organization and the environment that it's operating in.
Absolutely. Except we have one fundamental problem in all that, is what you do with people who don't want to listen, who don't want to engage in them, who think that they have all the answers. And it requires a lot of energy to engage with those individuals in such a way that they're not allowed to pursue, in a way, potentially very destructive pathways. And I don't want to name too many names, but there are people that will spring to mind around the world at the moment.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, I've worked with them, and then I guess you can look at different organizations and nations and across. So it is a challenge to find a solution to, probably not to give up on in whatever form. But in a way, that takes me to the future, because we are where we are and we need to navigate through. And I think you've offered a lot of thoughts on how we navigate through. I know you said you're not optimistic about the future, but I've been and always been optimistic and hopeful and not being able to give up. Otherwise, I'd say I die if I give up. What do you believe could enable us to create a future that is more hopeful and more positive?
I suppose if our educational system and our all the things that we get involved in spent more time focusing on the importance of values, the importance of good communication, the importance of wisdom, we might have some chance. But I suppose part of my pessimism comes from not having the energy levels that you have, which I'm very envious of, and that might be to do with age, and it's also to do with a frustration that we don't seem to have learned the things that we should have learned. And I'm not so sure that we're running very fast just to stand still. And the more change that's going on in society, the more learning you have to have in a society and in individuals if you really want to turn that change into progress. because not all change is progress. And how you define progress is a values-driven activity and purpose and progress. And it's just very, I just going back to leadership, I come back time and time again to the incredible leadership qualities that we found in Nelson Mandela. And the only frustration that he must have as well is that all these qualities that he had have not been passed down enough to other people around the world. But there are a lot of people who are trying to do good things, an incredible amount of people doing good things. But they get messed about by the people who are power-driven, narcissistic, egotists.
Yeah. So thank you for that. So for me, there's something about shining the light on the works of Nelson Mandela, but not shining the light on him as just this wonderful person, but shining the light on him as he did. Yes, you can go and do, learn the lessons, and beginning to shine the lights on other people that are leading in a value-focused manner so that other people can learn from it. And I say, that's hopefully what I am doing with this very podcast and these conversations.
I think it's so badly needed, and your enthusiasm and optimism is so badly needed.
And I would say your wisdom as well, which I'm very grateful for you sharing. The question then is, as I said, this just touches the tip of the iceberg in terms of all your wisdom and all that you have to offer. I am going to search for your messages for the new millennium and all the wisdom that you have there so that I can share that. But if people wanted to contact you directly or wanted more of your work, where do we go to find out more about what you have to offer?
Well, I'm always surprised in this day and age how much of it has emerged onto the internet. But I'm happy for people to have my email address if there are things that they would like to discuss further or sources of information that they would like me to send on to them. I think you have that, and
I do, definitely, and I will share the link to your email address. And I'm also going to offer you a challenge, and that is for you to possibly create a portfolio or just an online index with the different headings that you have around things like wisdom, values, power, responsibility, just a few headings with the work that you have under those headlines, because as I said, you have so much to offer, so much that people can learn from, and it would be nice if it's as accessible as possible for people to be able to
I'll send
get hold
you
of.
some material and see whether that is enough and where we could take it from there.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So thank you very much for an amazing, thought-provoking conversation. which I very much appreciate. Thank you,
I've very
Bruce.
much enjoyed it, and I hope that the messages that you're trying to encourage people to think about and turn into wise action get through, because they're urgently needed.
Thank you.
Thank you.